There is a fence behind the smithy at the north end of Sage Crossing. On the worst nights of the winter, there is a blanket on it. Not a rag. A good wool blanket, gray with a red stripe, worth about $4, which in that valley was 3 days' work. He puts it out when the snow starts. He takes it in at first light. He has done it every winter for 9 years. Fetch that in, Jonas. You'll ruin it. He never answers. The men at the livery had a bet running on it one season. The children were told to leave him be. The name that stuck was the Mad Smith, and it stuck because nobody had a better one. He was not mad. He had one eye and a forge and a fence, and every time it snowed, he hung out the only thing in that house worth anything, and stood in the door a while, and went back in. So what was the blanket for? And who was he expecting to come down off that pass in the middle of a blizzard? To tell it right, we have to go back to the autumn of 1880, 9 years before. Back to when Jonas Pike still had 2 eyes and a daughter. The smithy sat at the north end of the street, where the road came down off the pass, and it had been a Pike forge for 30 years. Jonas was 42 that autumn, big through the arms the way smiths are, slow to speak, and when he did speak, it generally settled the matter, which is a dangerous habit in a man who is sometimes wrong. His wife had died of the fever in '76. That left the girl. Rosalind Pike was 18, and everybody called her Roz. She had her father's dark red hair and none of his silence. She kept the books for the forge. She ran the bellows when Cal Teague was down with his back, and she could shoe a horse if she had to, though her father did not like her doing it where folks could see. It's not the work, he told her once. It's what they'll make of it. Let them make of it what they like. That's easy to say at 18. It's easy to say at any age, Roz said. Most folks just quit saying it. That autumn she started keeping company with Royce Culpepper. Royce was 22, and he was the second son of Emmett Culpepper, who owned 900 acres, a quarter share of the freight line, and the note on about half the buildings on that street, including, as it happened, the note on the Pike Forge. He was not a bad-looking boy. He had a way of listening that made a person feel worth listening to, which is a talent, and like most talents, it can be used either way. Jonas found out in October, the way fathers do, which is last. You've been walking out with the Culpepper boy. Roz went on wiping the counter. I have. Since when? August. Jonas set the hammer down. Roz, that family holds paper on this building. I'm aware. Do you know what that means? It means if it goes wrong, they can put us out. She turned around. Yes, Father. I worked that out in August. And you went anyway. I did. Jonas looked at her a long moment. Then be careful. I'm always careful. No, he said. You're brave. That's a different thing, and it costs more. She told him in February. She did not lead up to it. That was not her way, and I have always thought it was the bravest thing in this whole story, and it did her no good at all. Father, I'm going to have a child. Jonas Pike stood at that forge with a horseshoe in the tongs. He did not move for about 4 seconds. Then he put the shoe in the water, and it hissed. And he said, without turning around, does he know? He knows. He put the tongs down, and he's going to speak to his father. The shoe was still in the water. He had not taken it out. When? Sunday. Sunday came. Royce Culpepper did speak to his father. That much was true, and on Monday morning, Emmett Culpepper came down to the smithy himself, with his hat on, and he did not get off his horse. Pike, Mr. Culpepper, I'll not draw this out. My boy tells me your girl has made an accusation. Jonas straightened up. She's made no accusation. She's told the truth. That is the same thing when there's a name attached. Culpepper leaned on the horn of his saddle. My son says it isn't his. The forge went very quiet. Then your son is a liar. My son, said Culpepper, is 22 years old, and he will marry a Hollister girl out of Cheyenne in June. That has been settled since he was 15. He straightened up in the saddle. Now, I hold the note on this building. I am not going to say another word about that, and I'd thank you to notice that I'm not. He turned his horse. Get her out of this valley, Pike, quietly. And nobody has to say anything else. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a man's whole life turns. And it did not turn the way anybody watching would have guessed. Jonas Pike did not lose the forge. Emmett Culpepper never called that note. He never had to. The threat was enough, and a threat is cheaper than a foreclosure. And Culpepper was a careful man. What happened was worse and smaller, and it happened inside one house. It took 11 days. 11 days of the street going quiet when Roz walked down it. 11 days of Verna Sloat crossing over, rather than pass her on the same side. 11 days of a man coming in for a wagon, rim, and looking at the floor while he waited. And every one of those days, Jonas Pike stood at that forge. And the note in his chest got louder. Because here is what he was actually afraid of. And he never once said it out loud, which is the whole of his crime. He was not afraid of losing the building. He was afraid that everything, his family was 30 years of pike work in that valley. His father's name over that door was going to end up as a story. People told about a girl. On the 12th night, he had been drinking, which he did not usually do. He did it because he had decided something, and he could not stand to be sober while he did it. Roz came in from banking the forge. There's a coach Thursday, he said. She stopped in the doorway. To where? East. Your mother's cousin is in Sydney. I've written. You've written? It's arranged. Roz stood there a while. Say the rest of it, Father. There's nothing else to say. There is. Her voice did not rise. Say it out loud so we both have to hear it. And Jonas Pike, who was slow to speak, and whose speech generally settled matters, said the thing that settled this one. You'll go Thursday, and you'll not come back to this valley. Because of what he did. Because of what it's made of us. Us. Roz laughed once, and there was nothing in it. There's no us in this, Father. There's me. You've just been standing near it. Roz. No. You've had 11 days to say one sentence in that street. She was crying now, and she was furious about it. 1. My daughter is not a liar. That's all it was. And every day you didn't say it, they got a little more sure. It would have cost us the building. I know exactly what it would have cost. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. That's what makes it a choice. She went upstairs, and she was down in 20 minutes with a carpet bag. The coach isn't till Thursday. I'm not waiting 3 days in a house where I've been sold. He got between her and the door. It was the only time in this story he did. Roz, don't. She got to the door. And this is the part I want you to hold on to, because everything else in this story hangs off the next 40 seconds. She stopped with her hand on the latch. There's snow coming, she said. I know it. I'll go as far as the Kessler place tonight. They'll take me in. Roz, I'm not asking you for anything. She still had not turned around. I want to tell you one thing, and then I'll go. Jonas said nothing. If it ever changes, Roz said, I won't know. I'll be 400 miles off and you'll not write. You'll have decided by then that it was the right thing. And a man doesn't write to apologize for the right thing. Roz, so put something out. He looked up. What? On the fence. where it can be seen from the top of the pass. She turned around then, and her face was a wreck, and her voice was perfectly steady. If it ever changes, if there's ever a night you'd have me back in this house, put something out where I can see it from up there. You're not coming back over that pass. No, she said. Probably not. She opened the door. But you'll know whether you put it out. And so will I. She walked out into the beginning of that snow at about 9 in the evening. On the 26th of February, 1881, she was 19 years old and 4 months gone. Jonas Pike stood in that doorway and watched her to the end of the street, and then he went back inside and sat down. At about 2 in the morning, he got up and went out to the forge. I do not know exactly what he meant to do out there. I do not think he did either. He was drunk. He had just done the largest thing he would ever do, and he could not sit in a room with it. What he did was light the fire and start work, because that was the only thing his hands knew how to do with a night like that. He was hammering a wagon tire at about 3 when it went. A tire band under heat can carry a flaw you cannot see. When it lets go all at once. Cal Teague found him at 6 in the morning on the floor of that smithy. He kept the arm. He kept the hand. He lost the left eye entirely. And there was never any question about it from the first hour. Doc set what could be set, and covered what could not, and told him to keep it covered. And Jonas Pike wore a black patch over that socket every day for the rest of his life. He was 3 weeks getting up. The first day he could stand, he went out and looked at the fence behind the smithy. Then he went inside and took the good wool blanket off his own bed, gray with a red stripe, the one his wife had brought into that house in '72, and he carried it out and hung it over the top rail. It snowed that night. He stood in the doorway of that smithy until first light, with the wind coming down off the pass, looking at a road that nobody came down. Then he took the blanket in and folded it. That was the first one. There would be 9 winters of them. He looked for her that spring. I want that on the record, because of what the Valley decided about him later. He wrote to the cousin in Sydney in April, and the letter came back in June, unopened, marked, "Not at this address." He wrote to a man he knew in Ogallala. He paid a freighter $3 to ask after a young woman, traveling east alone in February, and the freighter came back in August and said there had been 100 of those. In September, he went himself. Cal Teague minded the forge for 11 days. He got as far as North Platte. He stood in a street he did not know, with one eye, and no notion which way to turn. Then he came home. Nothing. Nothing. Cal did not push it. He was 60, and he had known Jonas since the boy was at the bellows, and he had his own opinions about what had happened in that house in February. And he kept every one of them to himself for 9 years, which is a kind of loyalty most people never get asked for. "You'll want the fire up," he said. "There's the sloat wagon wants a rim." "Cal, I know it. I need to say it to somebody." Cal put the tongs down. "Then say it." I could have said 1 sentence in that street. Jonas was looking at the floor. That's the whole of it. 1 sentence, and I'd have paid for it, and she'd have stayed. You're not going to tell me it wasn't like that." "No," Cal said. "I'm not." Now the second blanket. This is the part I need you to notice, because nobody in Sage Crossing ever did. It happened in November of that first year, about 9 months after she walked out. He was up in the loft after a leak, and he moved a trunk to get at the boards, and the lid came off it. Inside was a child's blanket. It was small, maybe 4 foot square, blue, badly faded, with a border. His wife had worked in white thread the winter Roz was born. It had been on that girl's bed until she was 11, and refused to have it there any longer. Then it went in the trunk. It had not come out in 8 years. Jonas Pike sat on the floor of that loft, with it in his hands, for a long while. Then he took it downstairs. And that night, when the snow started, he hung 2 blankets on the fence. The gray one on the left post, and the little blue one beside it. He did that every snowfall for 9 winters. And he never once explained it to a living soul. And the valley made of it exactly what you would expect. He's got 2 out tonight. 2? See for yourself. That was the winter the name stuck. Here is what the town saw over 9 years. A one-eyed smith who did good work and would not talk. A man who hung bedding on a fence in a blizzard. A man whose daughter had gone off somewhere east in disgrace, and who never spoke her name. Not once, not in 9 years, in a valley where everybody knew it anyway. And here is the thing about a story like that. It hardens. The first winter it was gossip. The third winter it was a fact. By the 6th winter there were children in Sage Crossing who had never known a time without it. To them, the mad smith, hanging blankets in the snow, was simply true about the world, like the pass being closed in March. Nobody asked him. In 9 years, not one person in that valley walked up to that door and asked him what the blankets were for. They had a story. The story was easier. The closest anybody came was a boy. It was the winter of '85, and there were 3 of them at that fence at first light, daring each other, the way boys are. The slope boy got as far as putting a hand on the gray one. Jonas came round the corner of the shop with an armload of coal. The other 2 ran. The slope boy did not, because he had frozen, which happens. "Mister, take your hand off that." He took his hand off it. Jonas set the coal down. He was not angry. That was the part the boy told wrong for years afterward. He told it as the mad smith, roaring at him. And it was not that at all. "What did you want with it? Toby said you'd not come out." Toby was wrong. Jonas looked at him a moment. "How old are you?" 9. 9. Something went across his face. "Go on home." "It's cold." The boy got as far as the corner. Then he turned around, because he was 9 and he could not help it. "Mister, what's it for?" And Jonas Pike stood in his own yard with a fence and 2 blankets and 1 eye. And he looked at that child a long moment. And he could not do it. "Go home," he said. That boy grew up and stayed in that valley and told that story at the livery for years. He always told it the same way. I asked him, and he wouldn't say. He never once told it as I asked him, and he could not. The forge went down slowly, not all at once. Culpepper never called that note I told you that, and it stayed true. But a man does not need to be ruined to be finished. Some of it was the eye. Depth is what a smith works by, and he had lost half of it. And for 2 years his work came out honest but slow. Folks who wanted a rim in a hurry took it to Marrow Creek. Some of it was the talk. There is no man alive who wants his horse shod by somebody the town calls mad. And some of it, most of it, if we are honest, was that Jonas Pike stopped trying to be liked. He did the work. He took the money. He said good morning. And at some point in about the 4th year, the street stopped expecting anything else of him. And that suited both sides. Cal Teague died in the winter of '86. He was 66, and it was his chest, and it took 9 days, and Jonas sat with him for 6 of them. Near the end, Cal said one thing worth carrying. "You've never once told me why, too." Jonas did not answer. 9 years, Jonas. I've swept that yard. I've seen you put them out. Cal's breath was bad. I never asked because I reckoned you'd tell me when you could. I'd like to have known, is all. I'd have told you. Well, Cal almost laughed, and it cost him. Then you've cut it fine, haven't you? He went on the 9th day. Jonas Pike buried him and came home and banked the forge. And it snowed that night, and he put 2 blankets on the fence. Now, before we go on, if you're still with me, do me one small thing. Tell me in the comments what the weather's doing where you are. There's snow on the ground in this one, and I'm curious how it looks out your window tonight. All right, back to that valley. By the winter of '89, he was 51, and he looked 70. The forge took in about 1/3 of what it had. He kept the fire because of cold. Forge cracks. And because a man has to get up for something. Verna Sloat had taken to crossing the street again, which she had done 9 years before for a different reason. And I have always thought there was a kind of justice in that which nobody in that town noticed. Royce Culpepper had married the Hollister girl in '81, as arranged. He had 3 children and a house on the South End, and he was on the school board. He passed that smithy twice a week for 9 years, and he never once looked at it, which takes a discipline most men do not have. Emmett Culpepper died in '88. There were 400 people at the funeral. Royce came into that shop exactly 1 time. It was the March after his father's funeral, and his horse threw a shoe on the North Road, which meant to Pike Forge, or 11 miles on foot. He let it in. Jonas was at the fire. Pike. Jonas looked at the hoof and not at him. Near 4. That's right. He got the horse up and went to work. And neither man said anything for about 6 minutes. And it was the longest 6 minutes either of them ever spent in a building. Then Royce Culpepper said the only thing he ever said about it. I'd have taken it to Marrow Creek. I know. Jonas did not look up from the hoof. It's 11 miles. I know that too. Jonas set the hoof down and straightened up. And for the first time in 9 years, the two of them were looking at each other. She had a child, Jonas said. In the August, Royce's face did not move. I don't know that. No, Jonas said. You don't. That's the arrangement. He picked up the rasp. $1.25. Royce Culpepper put the coin on the anvil and led his horse out. And that was the whole of it. And he never came back. He did not look at the fence on the way out. I have always thought he must have wanted to. And every time it snowed, an old smith with one eye went out to a fence behind his shop and hung out 2 blankets and stood in the doorway a while and went back in. That is what the valley knew. Now I will tell you what they did not. The gray blanket was for her. That much anybody could have worked out, if anybody had bothered. It said, "This house is open. Come down." The little blue one was not for her. Think about when he found it. November, 9 months after a girl walked out of that door. 4 months gone. He did the arithmetic on the floor of that loft with the trunk lid in his lap. He came out at August, and he understood something. 400 miles east of him, there was a child, born in the summer, while he was paying a freighter. $3 to ask after a woman traveling alone. He never knew if it lived. He never knew if it was a boy or a girl. He had no way on this earth to find out. So he put its mother's blanket on the fence beside his wife's, and he hung them, both every time it snowed, for 9 years. That was the message. That was the whole of it. Bring the child. He could not write it. He did not know where to send it. He could not say it out loud in a valley that had already decided what he was. So he said it the only way he had, on a fence, in a blizzard, in a language of exactly 2 words, to somebody he had no reason to believe would ever be standing at the top of that pass to read it. And here is the thing that turns this whole story, and I have never been able to decide whether it is the cruelest part or the kindest. She was. 9 winters she was up there. Every one of them. Rosalind Pike got as far as Sidney, Nebraska. The cousin would not have her. I would rather not write that sentence. But it happened. And everything after it comes out of it. She was 4 months gone. She was unmarried. The cousin was a Methodist with 3 daughters of her own. You can't stay here, Rosalind. I've come 300 miles. I know it. I've got $2. Then you've got more than you came with. The cousin would not look at her. There's a boarding house in North Platte, Moen. They take girls. They take girls. That's what I said. Roz did not move off the step. Say the rest of it. There's no rest of it. Say it, Roz said. You've thought it since I got off that wagon. Say it out loud, and I'll go. The cousin shut the door. The boarding house was kept by a woman named Hetty Mullen. Hetty was 51. She had been widowed twice. And she had a rule about girls in that condition. The rule was that she did not ask. You'll want the back room. I can pay a week. I didn't say anything about paying. Hetty took the bag off her. Can you work a mangle? I can learn more. That's not what I asked. No, Roz said. I can't. Well, Hetty almost smiled. That's the first straight answer I've had out of a girl in that hallway in 4 years. You'll do. In August of 1881, Roz Pike had a son in that back room. Hetty Moen held her hand. A doctor came for $4. She named him Jonas. Hetty asked her about that once. That's your father's name. It is. Hetty waited for more and did not get it. The one that put you out. That's the one. In February, Hetty set the basin down. In the snow. In the snow. And you've hung his name on this child. Roz did not look up. He taught me my letters, she said. He sat up with me 9 nights when I had the fever. He never once in his life raised a hand to me. He also did what he did. I know what he did. I was there. She moved the blanket off the baby's face. Both of those are true things, Hetty. I'll not throw out the second because of the first. That's a very generous arithmetic. It isn't generous at all. Roz's voice was flat. It's just correct. Hetty Moen did not have an answer for that. Roz stayed 11 years in North Platte. She worked the laundry. Then she kept its books. By 86, she was running that house alongside Hetty. She had a room upstairs and a boy in school. She wrote to her father 4 times. She never sent one of them. Hetty found all 4 in a tin afterward. She read them. She burned 3. I do not know to this day what was in them. But every winter, she went to the pass. The first time was February of 82. Her boy was 6 months old. She left him with Hetty. She rode the freight as far as it went and walked the rest. 9 days out, 9 days back. She came up the east side of that pass in the last of the light. She lay down behind a rock at the top, and she looked down at Sage Crossing. There was a blanket on that fence. She stayed up there about 2 hours. Now I want to be careful here. This is where the whole thing turns. Get it wrong, and it looks like foolishness. It was not foolishness. She saw the gray blanket. She knew exactly what it meant. Her father was telling her the door was open, and she did not go down. Here is why. I want you to hear from her, not from me. She told Hetty years later in that kitchen. You've been going up there 5 years. I have. Hetty said it to the window, not to her. And it's always out. Always. Then what in God's name are you doing in my laundry, girl? Hetty put the iron down hard. Your father stood a blanket on a fence 5 winters running. That's not a hint. That's a man shouting. I know it. Then go home. He'd take me. Roz kept folding. I've never doubted that for a day. He'd have me in that house tomorrow morning, and he'd not ask me one question. So go. And Joe? Hetty did not answer. Say it, Hetty. You're the only one I can say it to. I don't know what he'd do about the boy. No, Roz said. Nor do I. He might. He might be kind to him. I expect he would be. He's a kind man who did one cowardly thing. She set the sheet down. That's not what I'm afraid of. Then what? That valley. Roz looked at her. There's 400 people in it. Every one of them knows what my name is worth now. If I walk that child down that street, he isn't a boy. He's the answer to a question people have been chewing on for 5 years. Children forget. Children remind. Roz picked the sheet back up. There'd be a boy at that school who'd learned it off his mother, and another one behind him. It would never once be his fault, and it would follow him to 50. Hetty was quiet a while. So you'll do this instead, 9 days out and 9 days back, and lie in the snow like a poacher. Yes. For how long? Until he's big enough that it can't hurt him, Roz said. Then I'll take him down that hill myself. She never got that far, but that was the plan. I want that on the record, too. She went up 9 times. 82, 83, every February when the laundry was slow. 9 days out and 9 days back to lie behind a rock in the cold and look at a fence 400 yards below. And every year there were 2 blankets on it. She saw them. Of course she saw them. She had eyes, and there was nothing else up there to look at. She thought the second one was a spare. That is the tragedy of Jonas Pike, and I will say it plainly. He spent 9 winters saying, "Bring the child." She spent 9 winters reading it as "Come home." There were 2 blankets on that fence for 9 years. One of them was a sentence. She never once read it. Nobody had told her there was anything to read. Roz Pike died in November of 1888. It was a lung sickness. It took 4 months. She was 27 years old. Her son was 7. She talked to him near the end. Hetty Mullen was in the room and told it after. Joe, do you know where I go in the winters? The mountains. To a pass. Above a town called Sage Crossing. She had to stop for breath. At the north end of that town, there's a smithy. It's got a fence behind it. All right. When it snows, there's a blanket on that fence. Gray, with a red stripe woven in. All right. She gripped his hand until he looked at her. Say it back to me. Gray, with a red stripe. Good. She held his hand. That's my father. That's your grandfather. And when that blanket's out, it means the door is open. The boy thought about it. Then why don't we go? And Rosalind Pike, who had 9 days left, said the only untrue thing she ever said to her son. Because it's a long way. She died on the 9th of November. Hetty Mullen kept the boy. She was 61 by then. She kept him 2 years, and she did it well. Then, in the autumn of 90, her chest went the way Roz's had, and she knew what that meant. So in November, she sat that boy down. How old are you? 9. 9. Hetty was quiet a moment. Joe, I'm not going to be here. You're getting better. I'm not, Mrs. Purdy said. Mrs. Purdy is being kind. I am not going to be. She took his hand. You're old enough to be told the truth. There's nobody left to tell it to you but me. So listen. He listened. Your mother told you about a fence. A blanket on a fence. What color? Gray. With a red stripe. And what does it mean? That the door's open. That's right. Hetty sat back. Now I'm going to tell you how to get there. Here is the part I still cannot quite get over. Hetty Mullen had $2.40 in the world. She had a boy she could not keep, and she did not send him to the county. She spent $1.80 of it on a freight seat west as far as Ogallala. She wrote the road out on paper in a hand the boy could read. She sewed the last 60 cents into the lining of his coat. Then she told him the one thing that mattered. You go up that pass, and you look down. If there's a blanket on that fence, you go and knock on that door. And if there isn't? Hetty Moen looked at that child a long moment. Then you come back to me, she said, and we'll think of something else. You promise? I promise. She was lying. She knew she was lying. There would be nothing to come back to, and she knew it. She said it anyway. He was 9 years old. He had 400 miles to go, and he needed to be able to put one foot in front of the other. He left on the 4th of December, 1890. It took him 19 days. I am not going to dress up what that was. A 9-year-old traveling alone in December is not an adventure. The freight took him to Ogallala. After that, he walked. He got rides on wagons when a driver would take him. Weather kept him 2 nights in a livery at Julesburg. 4 different people fed him who had no reason to. One of them was a freighter named Ordway. He picked the boy up outside Sydney and carried him 11 miles. Where's your people? Sage Crossing. Ordway looked at the size of him. That's away yet. I know it. Ordway chewed on that a while. Who've you got there? My grandfather. He know you're coming? The boy did not answer. Son. Ordway pulled the team up. He know you're coming? No, sir. Does he know you exist? And that boy sat on a freight wagon in Nebraska in December and gave the only answer he had. There's a blanket on his fence, he said, so I reckon he does. Ordway looked at him a long moment. Then he clicked the team on. He gave him bread at chapel and would not take the coin for it. He told that story for 30 years and never once got it straight, because he never learned how it came out. The weather caught him at Julesburg. A man named Pardo let him sleep in the tack room 2 nights. On the second morning, he asked one question. You running from somebody? No, sir. Sure about that? Yes, sir. Because I'd not send a boy back to a bad house. I've done it once, and I think about it still. It's not a bad house. You've not been there. No, sir. Then how do you know? The boy thought about that a while. Because he keeps it out in the snow, he said. Keeps what out in the snow? The blanket. Pardo stopped what he was doing. What blanket? The one that means you can come in. Pardo did not know what that meant. He gave him a scarf anyway. The boy lost the paper with the road on it somewhere past Sydney. He kept going west. West was the only instruction he had left. He came up the east side of that pass on the 23rd of December. The worst storm of that winter was beginning. He was on his hands and knees for the last half mile. He had been out in it since first light. And at the top, he climbed onto the rock his mother had lain behind 9 times. He looked down at a valley he had never seen in his life. In the dark, in a blizzard, there were 40 houses down there, and every one of them was black. He could not see a fence. He could not see a smithy. He could see nothing at all. Only snow going sideways, and very far below, 1 square of yellow light. He stood up there a long time. Now, 400 yards below, Jonas Pike was standing in the door of his smithy at about 8 in the evening. It had started snowing at 4. He had gone out at 5. He hung the gray blanket on the left post and the little blue one beside it, the way he had done it perhaps 200 times. Then he came in. He ate. He sat down. And at 8 o'clock he got up and went to the door, because he always did. He could not see the fence. The snow was coming too hard. He stood there a while with his hand on the frame. And then Jonas Pike did a thing he had never done in 9 winters. He could not have told you why. I have thought about it a great deal. He went out into that yard. He took the lantern off its hook, and he hung it on the fence post above the blankets, just so they could be seen. There was nobody to see them. There had never been anybody to see them. It was the 23rd of December, in a blizzard. A 52-year-old man with one eye went out in it to put a light on two pieces of cloth for the benefit of nobody at all. Then he went inside and sat down by the fire. Up on that pass, a boy who had been about to start down the wrong side of the mountain saw a light come on. It took him 2 hours and 10 minutes to get down. He came into that yard at 10:15. The snow was over his boots. He stopped at the fence and put his hand on the gray blanket. Then he found the little blue one. He did not know what it was. Nobody had told him about a second one. His mother had said a gray one with a red stripe. And there it was, exactly as promised. 9 years and 400 miles later, he knocked on the door. Jonas Pike opened it. There was a child standing in his yard in a coat that was not enough. He was holding the door frame because he could not stand on his own anymore. For about 3 seconds, neither of them said anything. Then the boy said the thing he had carried for 19 days. "Is this the house with the blanket?" I have told this story a good many times. I have never once got through that line without stopping. Jonas Pike went down on his knees in his own doorway. "What's your name?" "Joe." "Joe what?" "Jonas Pike." The boy was shaking too hard to say it clean. "After my grandfather." "Say that again." "After my grandfather." "No." The old man's voice went. "The first part." "Say the first part again." "Jonas Pike." He got him inside. He got the coat off him and the boots off him. He sat him in front of the fire and got broth into him. The child fell asleep sitting up with the cup still in his hands, about 11 o'clock. Jonas Pike sat on the floor beside him the rest of that night and did not sleep at all. Sometime before dawn, the boy woke. "Sir, I'm here. My mother died." "I know it. I worked that out 2 years ago, in November." The boy's voice was very small. "She went up to your pass every winter." Jonas did not move. "Every winter. Everyone. She told me before she died." The old man's hand had stopped on the boy's blanket. "How many?" She said 9. The old man put his hand flat on the floor, the way a man does when the room has moved. 9. She said there was always a blanket. The boy watched the fire. She said it meant the door was open. It did. His voice was not working properly. It did mean that. Then why didn't she come? And there it was. The question that Valley never asked, put to him at 4 in the morning by a 9-year-old. "I don't know," Jonas said. "You must know." "No." He shook his head slowly. "That's the one thing I've never known." The boy thought about it. She said we couldn't go because it was a long way. It is a long way. The boy turned that over. "You went out in the snow every time it snowed." "I did." "For 9 years, grandfather?" "For 9 years." "That's a lot of times," the boy said, "for somebody who isn't coming." Jonas Pike put his hands over his face. Then he took them down again, because there was something he had to ask. "Joe, sir, did she say anything about the other one?" The boy looked up. "The other what?" That is the moment. That is the whole story in 4 words. The other what? 9 winters, 400 yards, 2 pieces of cloth on a fence. She saw them every single time. She thought one was a spare. Jonas Pike got up off that floor. He went out into the yard in the dark in his shirt sleeves. He came back in with the little blue blanket, stiff with ice, and stood holding it. "This was your mother's," he said, "when she was small. Her own mother worked that border in white thread." The boy touched it. "Why was it out there?" "Because of the gray one." "I don't understand." "No." Jonas sat down heavily. "No, and nor did she. And that's mine to carry, not yours." "Tell me anyway." And Jonas Pike who was slow to speak, and whose speech generally settled matters, finally said the sentence he had been trying to send 400 miles for 9 years. The gray one said, "Come home," he said. The blue one said, "Bring the child." The boy looked at the blanket in the old man's hands. "Which child?" "You," Jonas said. "Whoever you turned out to be. I didn't know. I never knew if you'd been born." The boy did not understand it that night. He was 9. He understood it when he was about 19. All at once, standing in that same yard, he had to go and sit down on the step. His grandfather came out and found him there. "You're not well." "I'm well." His grandfather did not go back in. "You're sat on a step in November. I worked something out." Jonas waited. The blue one. Joe did not look up. "You put it out the 1st November, 9 months after she went." "I did." "So you knew there was a child before there was a child." "I knew there'd likely be one, and you had no notion what I was." He turned round. "Boy or girl, living or dead?" "You didn't know my name. You didn't know I'd been born at all." "No. You hung a blanket out for 9 years for somebody who might never have existed." Jonas Pike sat down on the step beside him. It took him a while, at 62. Why? "Because if I'd left it in that trunk," Jonas said, "and you had existed then, I'd have been a man who left it in the trunk." They sat there a while. "That's the whole of it?" "That's the whole of it." Joe looked out at the fence. "You should have written it on something." "I know it." "Anything. A board. A word." "I know it, Joe." "She'd have come." "Aye," his grandfather said. "She'd have come." They were a household after that. I will not make it prettier than it was. A 52-year-old man with one eye and a grieving child are not an easy fit. There were 2 years in there that were hard on both of them. But the boy went to the school. He was good at figures, like his mother. He worked the bellows from 10 and the hammer from 14. By the time he was 20, there was a second name on that door. And the valley, this is the part I want you to have. The valley did not apologize. Not one person in Sage Crossing ever walked up to Jonas Pike and said, "We were wrong about you." That is not how a town works. A town cannot say that. A town is not a person. And the ones who had been worst about it had the most reason to stay quiet. What happened instead was smaller and slower. They stopped calling him the Mad Smith. Within a year, every soul in that valley knew what the blankets had been for. A 9-year-old told anybody who asked. Children do not know when a thing is supposed to be a secret. And that was the end of the story. The town had been telling itself for 9 years. Verna Sloat came to that door in February. She had crossed the street to avoid it for 9 years. She stood on the step with a pie and a cloth. There was extra. Was there. She held the cloth out a little further. "I made too much." They stood there. "It's a bad month for pie," Jonas said. "Nothing to make one out of in February." Verna Sloat's chin went. "No," she said. "There isn't." He took the pie. "Thank you, Verna." She got as far as the gate before she turned round. "That boy favors her." "He does." About the eyes. She was not looking at him. "I'd have known him anywhere. You'd have had to see her first." "I know it. I'm not saying it to wound you." He shifted the pie to his other arm. "I've had 9 years to work out whose fault it was. And it comes back to me every time." Verna Sloat stood at that gate a good while. "Yes," she said. "Well, that was as near to an apology as that valley ever managed. And I have decided over a good many years that it counts." He put the blankets away in the spring of 91. He made no ceremony of it. He folded them both and put them in the trunk in the loft. He never hung anything on that fence again for the rest of his life. There was no longer anybody it needed to be said to. Jonas Pike died in 1904. He was 66. It was quick. His grandson was at the forge and got to him inside a minute, which is more than most men get. They buried him beside his wife. They put his daughter's name on that stone as well, though she lies in Nebraska. The boy asked for it, and the stonecutter did not argue. Now, here is what I have made of it. Take it or leave it. That man did 9 winters of penance in a language nobody had taught his daughter to read. He could not say it out loud. He had proved that already. He stood in a street for 11 days and failed to say one sentence. It cost him everything. He never forgot it. So he found a way of speaking that did not require him to open his mouth in front of that town. He used it faithfully for 9 years, and it very nearly did not work. It worked because a lantern came on, not because of the blankets. He hung those for 9 years, and they never once brought her down that hill. What brought that child down was that on the one night it mattered, an old man went out into a blizzard to make sure a thing could be seen. So here is the whole of it. If you are sorry, say it out loud, to the person, in words. It is cheaper tonight than it will ever be again. And if you cannot, if you are the sort of person who cannot, and there are a great many of us then, at least hang the thing where it can be seen, and on the worst night, go out and put a light on it. Now let me ask you something. Would you have gone down that hill? 9 winters, 400 yards, a child in your arms, and a town below that had already made up its mind about you. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Rest easy now. There will be another one waiting the next time you come this way.